What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here, and I want to talk to you about a book that I recently finished reading. The Daredevil Visionaries by Frank Miller, Volume 1. I am probably the last person on the planet to actually start reading the Frank Miller Daredevil Visionaries. I have been, for about 2 years now, reading Essential Daredevil, Volumes 1 through 6, and those books are all pretty thick. You can actually see them over there behind me, right there. That's the first 6 volumes of Essential Daredevil, and those are a lot of comics. That's like 160-something issues of Daredevil right there, I think. Or actually, it might be about 140-ish something issues. Anyway, in my review of Essential Daredevil Volume 6, I said that there was about 20-something issues in between Volume 6 and where Miller begins. That's actually not true. It's actually more like 15-ish issues in between the end of that volume and the beginning of this volume. But anyway, pretty much anytime I ever told somebody, hey, I'm reading old school Daredevil, or if they find out that I've never read any Daredevil before other than the Silver Age stuff, almost everyone says, alright, stop what you're doing right now, you need to read Frank Miller's Daredevil. And I want to go ahead and say, this is really good. Anyone who ever hyped this up as being a really good run, they were not wrong. Now, I have not read the next 2 volumes or the 2 additional volumes that Miller worked on after that. I have not read any of that, so I don't know if it gets better or worse. I've only heard good things about Miller's Daredevil run, so I can't imagine that it gets worse after this volume. But this book is really good. Having said that, for all you people out there who are saying you need to just stop what you're doing and read Miller's Daredevil, or people who say you don't have to read those 6 volumes of Essential Daredevil, you can just jump right into Miller, I'm going to say I kind of disagree. Now, I first want to say I don't think that anybody should read those 6 volumes of Essential Daredevil. I think there are a few good jewels in that run. I think that Marv Wolfman's run on the book, which you can find in Volume 6, I think it's really good. But other than that, I think that it took the Daredevil series a long time to really find what it wanted to be. I think that if you jump into Miller, you're going to get something really good, but also there's going to be some stuff here that might be a little bit confusing to you. Now, maybe I'm wrong, because most people, when they read Daredevil, they just read the Miller run, and then the Bendis run, and then maybe the more recent Mark Waid stuff. Most people don't do what I did, and they start literally from the very beginning and move forward to read every Daredevil story that's out there. Most people don't do that, but I'm one of those people, and I found it to be very beneficial to me reading the previous 140-something issues and then skipping over whatever's not collected, because there is a brief gap in between Essential Volume 6 and this that's not collected in trade as of now. Maybe someday it will be, I don't know. But skipping over that, I found it to be very beneficial to me. I think that if I had just skipped all of the Silver Age stuff and just started with Miller's run, I would have been a little bit confused. Now, like I said, everyone else in the world has read Miller's run, and I doubt that all those people who are talking about how great it is have read all of those 6 volumes of Essential Daredevil. So maybe I'm the only person who would have been confused if I just jump into this, but I do want to give a few examples of what I'm talking about. So the very first issue, Matt fights the Deathstalker, and the Deathstalker somehow knows that Matt is Daredevil. I don't know how he knows this, but the Deathstalker was a thorn in Daredevil's side for like 2 volumes. He was introduced, I want to say, in like Volume 4 of Essential Daredevil. We get his origin here. I was extremely surprised to see that. I thought that he was just going to continue being a mystery, and we were never ever going to find out who he was or why his powers worked the way they did. I thought, best case scenario, his origin stuff is not going to be happening in the Daredevil comic. They would probably happen in the Defenders series or something like that. No, the very first issue that Miller works on, we get to find out who the Deathstalker is and why his powers work the way that they do. It's this guy who had some machine that would knock him slightly out of phase. He appeared in like the first 50 issues of Daredevil. It was like 48 or 49, something like that. And I barely remember this guy. I vaguely remember reading that issue, and here it reveals that Daredevil did something to destroy the guy's weapon, and that kind of had an adverse effect on this guy. So then he created a new costume persona, the Deathstalker, and then here's where things don't make a lot of sense, because according to this issue, it says that the Deathstalker was going around trying to find machinery that could reverse the process that made him into the Deathstalker. That's not entirely true, because you look back at all of the Deathstalker's previous appearances, and they are not consistent with what we are told here. For example, the last time I read the Deathstalker before Miller's run, he was terrorizing Karen Page dressed up in this costume that her father wore, asking her about some nuclear physics that her father worked worked on. That would have absolutely nothing to do with restoring his humanity. There would be no reason for him to be seeking that out other than just greed, and it doesn't entirely fit with what Miller is giving here. Having said that, that doesn't really bother me because I'm glad that he was finally tying up all the Deathstalker stuff and just getting rid of that character so that we don't have him hanging out for another, I don't know, 40, 50 issues being spooky, but nobody ever being able to defeat him. So I'm really glad that we had that character tied up, and now we don't have to worry about him anymore. Also, you've got Daredevil's love life, which is somewhat complicated here, and also is a little bit more complex than what it was when we left off at the end of Volume 6. So Heather, who was introduced in Wolfman's Run, she's still here. I was surprised to see that. For some reason, I thought that Matt was going to be single at the beginning of Miller's run, and then Miller would introduce Elektra, who has not been introduced yet in this book, and then that would kind of complicate things a little bit for his life. I did not know that Miller was going to keep using the character of Heather, who was introduced in Marv Wolfman's Run. We've also got this girl, I don't even remember her name. I think that she is a secretary for Nelson and Murdoch. The problem is, this book does not do a very good job letting you know who that character is. If you haven't read any Daredevil before this, you will have no clue who this character is because she's there. At one point, she's waxing poetic about how much in love she is with Matt Murdock and how he kind of has a thing for Heather, but at the same time, he kind of has a thing for the Black Widow. I'll get to her in a minute. So she's there just hanging out, but we never really find out who she is. You can kind of gather from context clues that she works for Nelson and Murdoch, but even if you read those 6 volumes of Essential Daredevil, you're not going to know who this character is because she appears in that little gap in between Volume 6 and this volume. And Miller and the writer Roger McKenzie don't really do a good job telling us new readers who haven't read the previous 10 or 15 issues who this girl is. So I don't know. I guess she just appears one day and they hire her. But anyway, she's there and she has a crush on Matt Murdock, but nothing really comes of that in this volume. Maybe something will come up later, but for now, nothing really comes up. At the beginning of this volume, I kind of got the feeling that Heather and Matt had broken up, and then they go to her father's grave because apparently her father had hired Bullseye to try and kill Foggy and Matt, and then in between Volume 6 and this volume, we find out that it was actually the Purple Man who used his mind control powers to control Heather's father, and then Heather's father went to jail, and then he commits suicide in jail. All that is given to us in expository flashback stuff in this book, and I assume it happened somewhere on screen in the issues before this. But anyway, I kind of got the feeling that Heather and Matt were broken up when this book starts, and then they kind of sort of get back together by the end of the book. But anyway, I still like Heather. I don't think I like her as much as I did in Wolfman's Run. She's not as spunky as she was in Wolfman's Run. She's a little bit more morose, obviously so. Her father is dead. But also, I get the feeling that Frank Miller just doesn't know how to write a happy, well-adjusted character. Frank Miller writes very sad, broken, very dark, twisted stuff. Not necessarily twisted, but most of the time twisted. He writes grim and gritty. I think grim and gritty, the phrase, was actually put together in response to Frank Miller. I think he is the reason we have that phrase. And I will say, I like what he's doing here. There's a foreword here that Frank Miller wrote where he said 2 things that really stood out to me. Number 1, something funny. He said, basically, he and McKenzie were trying their hardest to steal every Spider-Man villain that they could without being noticed. I thought that was very funny. I laughed a little bit, although I do wish that they had used the Chameleon, because the Chameleon is a character who wasn't used very much in the first, 100 issues of Spider-Man, and he's a character who would have been awesome to see in Daredevil more than what he was. Number 2, I believe Miller, in this foreword, he said something to the effect of, he really had a urge to do more spooky crime stories, and he thought that Daredevil was the best place to do those stories. And I thought it was very interesting that he said that, because I don't think that someone like Frank Miller would be able to do what Frank Miller did today. I don't think that somebody would be able to come onto a book and say, okay, I want to write such and such a book. And such a book is not a place where you usually see urban crime stories, but I have this desire to do urban crime stories, so I want to do urban crime stories, and I'm just going to do those stories in the Daredevil comic. That's basically what Frank Miller said, and Frank Miller got away with it. Now, Daredevil is known as a very urban street crime book because of Frank Miller. Before this, you saw Daredevil fighting aliens. You saw him fighting a lot of superpowered characters. Now, that doesn't entirely go away here. In the first issue, he fights the Unholy Three and the Deathstalker. The Incredible Hulk appears here. There's a character with this Iron Man-esque super supersuit here named the Mauler. So all the fantastical stuff, it doesn't just disappear. We don't have Sin City just happening overnight in this book. You still got a lot of the Marvel Universe stuff happening in this book, in this world. But you can definitely see Miller's sensibilities as a crime storyteller starting to seep in, and I think it works for the best. Also, what else did I want to talk about? The Black Widow. Remember how I didn't really like the Black Widow and Daredevil as a couple? When they first were together, it seemed like they really did not like each other at all. They were always arguing, and then we got another creative team on board who made them a little bit more bearable when they were together, but they still didn't really work as a couple, in my opinion. And then they finally broke up with each other, and I was okay with that because I liked the Black Widow better than I liked Karen Page, but she still did not work for Daredevil as a romantic partner. Here, she just kind of comes back and she decides that maybe she wants to get back with Matt. I have no idea what happened to her chauffeur / bodyguard. He's not with her. Maybe that's explained in the issues before the Miller run starts, but she's back and she says that she wants to start a thing up with Matt again, and briefly they do. That's why it's a little weird that I'm not entirely sure what caused Heather and Matt to break up. I'm not sure if they broke up before this book or if they broke up when they were visiting her father's grave, because Matt says that he can't be with Heather because it would be dangerous. No, he doesn't say that. That's usually the spiel, but he says he has responsibilities, and then Heather slaps him and walks away, and I'm not sure if she had broken up with him already before that or if that is the moment that they broke up. But anyway, then Matt and Matt and Black Widow, they are together for a little bit, but then Matt goes and saves what's-her-face, Heather's life at the hands of Dr. Octopus, another Spider-Man villain that Frank Miller used, although he did not instantly become a Daredevil villain like, say, the Kingpin did after he was brought into Daredevil. But he goes and saves Heather's life, and then it's like, hey, Heather, I love you. And then Black Widow, she sees that, and then she leaves, and presumably she won't come back for a really long time. I would say she won't come back, period, but I do know that at some point in the 80s, there was a story that's been collected somewhat recently called The Widow's Kiss, or Kiss of the Widow. So unfortunately, Black Widow is going to come back. And I don't have anything against the Black Widow, but I really don't want her to be a supporting character in Daredevil. I just don't think that she works as a foil for Daredevil. I don't think that they worked as a couple at all. I don't think that her really strong, I am a strong, confident, independent woman, I don't think that that really worked. I thought it came off way too strong. I don't mind her being a strong, confident, independent woman, but that doesn't have to be the phrase that comes out of her mouth every other word. And also, I didn't really think that she worked here either in light of her being a strong, confident, independent woman in the 1970s, because here, she's way too passive. She doesn't come across as being the same character at all. In the 70s, she was very aggressive, very angry, always very bitter with Matt. Here, she's a doormat. She doesn't hardly say anything to Matt. She's extremely not the same character at all. So it's very weird if you've read some of the previous appearances with Daredevil and Black Widow, seeing that here, it's a very different relationship, and it's very strange that it starts, and almost immediately after it starts, it goes away. You're almost wondering, okay, why in the world did he even bring Black Widow in if he's just going to get rid of her in an issue later? We also have a character named Ben Urich who shows up here, and I am not sure if Ben Urich has appeared anywhere else before the Miller run starts. I'm not sure if he appeared in Daredevil or if he appeared in some other title, because he's working for the Daily Bugle, so logic would say that maybe he appeared in Spider-Man before he appears here, but I don't know that to be a fact. But anyway, basically the same thing that you get to see in the movie, where he finds out over the course of the movie that Matt Murdock is Daredevil, that same thing happens here, and I want to say that it's a really cool story, and it is a cool idea, but unfortunately it's not executed very well, because what's-his-face, Urich, he has Daredevil's file filed under M. He already has this theory that Matt Murdock is Daredevil, and then, like, the next issue after he already has that theory, he hears Heather saying something like, oh no, Matt! In a big crowd where Daredevil is fighting like the Hulk or something like that. And he's like right over there to the side, and he's like, she said Matt, and that's Daredevil. I think that it's Matt Murdock. And sure enough, it is. This would have been really cool if they played it kind of like they played the Jim Gordon thing in Batman Year One, where over the course of a story, we get to see this guy slowly find out all this information and decide, okay, is he really Matt Murdock? And he slowly gets all this bits and pieces of information, and he actually, investigates. That's not what we get to see here. We almost get to see him where he already has the answer. Somehow he already knows that Matt is Daredevil, and then all these pieces very conveniently fall into place for him, so he knows now that Matt is Daredevil, even though he already suspected that. I think it would have been better if he had no clue who Daredevil is, and we got to see him over the course of several issues investigating that, and then figuring out, okay, it's probably Matt Murdock. I think that would have been a better way to go about it. As is, it's kind of reversed, and a lot of people probably don't care. There's a lot of people out there who are just blind Miller fans, and you know what? That's fine. I'm a blind fan of a lot of other creators, but I will say, if you're reading this, that might be a little bit of a flaw for you. It was definitely a flaw for me. I still like seeing Ben Urich in this story. I just wish that his story of finding out who Matt Murdock is and then deciding if he's going to actually print the story or not, kind of like in the movie, I wish that that had been done a lot better than what it was. And also, probably if it was me, I would have given it a little bit more time to breathe so that it's not happening over the span of 3 issues. Also, what else do we have here? One weird thing, this does skip an issue. I didn't even tell you guys what issues are collected here. Let me do that real quick. This collects, it's like in the 160s, I believe. It collects issues 158, 159, 160, 161, 163, 164, 165, 166, 167. It skips 162 because that issue was basically a retelling of Matt Murdock's origin story by a different creative team. Frank Miller or Roger McKenzie, neither one of them were on it. I believe Steve Ditko drew 162. I don't remember who wrote that issue. It might have been Denny O'Neil, but I don't think so. But anyway, that issue, I looked it up. That was actually a retelling of Matt Murdock's origin story where Matt gets amnesia and then he becomes a boxer or something like that. Kind of a silly sounding issue. It sounds like something that would have happened in the 60s. What's weird about that is that less than 3 issues later, you've got Frank Miller retelling Daredevil's origin story. Now, admittedly, Frank Miller drawing Daredevil's origin story and Steve Ditko drawing Steve Ditko drawing Daredevil's origin story, those are extremely different things. Frank Miller is an entirely different artist than Steve Ditko. Steve Ditko is bombastic. He's flashy. You go and look at the early 60s Spider-Man or the early 60s Doctor Strange, it's like actually taking an acid trip without actually taking acid, if such a thing is even possible. And I say that as someone who never has dropped acid. Then you have Frank Miller, who is very in the shadows. He's very not blunt. What's the opposite of blunt? He's very subtle about the way he goes about his art. It's still a very stylistic art style. You look at that and you instantly say, okay, that is Frank Miller and that is Klaus Janson inking it. It's very easy to tell that that's what's going on. 2 extremely different styles here with Ditko and Miller. So it's not like you're getting the exact same comic if you read the Ditko origin story and the Miller origin story. But it's still a little strange that the issue that's skipped in this book, which you're not going to know this unless you're watching this video or you look it up, but the issue that's not collected in this book is an origin story of Matt Murdock, kind of refreshing you on his origin story, and then not even 5 issues later, we get the origin story once again, this time with a framing device of Ben Urich listening to the story as Daredevil tells him that story. So I thought that was a little weird. One other thing that I wanted to talk about was Roger McKenzie's work on this book. You talk about the Miller Daredevil run. Almost everyone has heard of the Miller Daredevil run. They'll say, okay, that was in the late 70s, early 80s. He had a somewhat lengthy run on the book, and then there was a couple other miniseries that he did later on. But almost nobody even knows who Roger McKenzie even is. I even looked this guy up because I had never heard of him before, and he has a Wikipedia article that is kind of vague on what all he's done. It says that he's most well known for his work on Daredevil. Not too long before this run began was when he first cracked into comics, so he didn't have a huge career before his run on Daredevil began, and you don't really hear a lot of people talk about McKenzie's contributions to this book. I don't even know where McKenzie begins and Miller ends. I have no idea what all here is Miller saying, hey, you know what would be really cool if we had Dr. Octopus, or if we threw the Hulk in, or if we had Ben Urich find out that Matt is Daredevil. I don't know what all is Miller's ideas and what all is McKenzie's, and I do think it's a little bit of a disservice noticed that so many people talk about the Miller run. Heck, this book is labeled as the Frank Miller Visionaries. So many people talk about what Frank Miller brought to the book, and he did bring a lot. Artistically, this is really good stuff, and you're starting to see here, early Frank Miller, you can even see where he's starting to get some of these things that he would later bring to his work in much later Miller stuff, like The Dark Knight Returns, or even Sin City, or stuff like that. You can start to see where some of his stylistic choices take their start in this book. So Frank Miller, he did bring a lot to Daredevil, but I think it's weird that nobody talks about what Roger McKenzie brought to Daredevil, or even people don't even talk about what that guy brought to comics. And for all I know, maybe he didn't bring that much to comics. Maybe people in the pro field, maybe they knew McKenzie and they knew how little he contributed. I have no idea. All I know is that Wikipedia article, it talks about his Daredevil run with Frank Miller, and then it jumps forward into the 2015s, where it says that he's now working for some indie company that I've never heard of before. It doesn't really talk a lot about what happened in between 1980 and today. So I don't know what Roger McKenzie contributed. I don't know when Roger McKenzie's run stops and when Frank Miller's run begins. I don't know how collaborative their work was. This is something I would really love to see a fly on the wall who was watching all of this happen report on this. Tell us, okay, here's what Frank Miller brought to the table, and here's what Roger McKenzie brought to the table. You talk about people who talk about like the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby thing, or the Stan Lee, Steve Ditko thing, and people say, who created the Fantastic Four? Was it Stan Lee? Was it Jack Kirby? Did they co-create? Mark Evanier said it best when he said, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee walked into a room. When they came out of the room, the Fantastic Four had been created. I think that's a really good way of putting it, and with those two guys, even though people discuss who brought more to the table with Stan Lee and all of his artistic collaborators, people discuss that all the time. I think it's really easy to tell what Stan Lee brought to the table and what his artists brought to the table, because all of those guys have huge bodies of work where you can look at everything that Stan Lee has done, and you can say, okay, it's pretty easy to tell this is an idea that Stan Lee had, and this is an idea that Jack Kirby had. I wish that there was more reporting on that same kind of thing going on with Roger McKenzie and Frank Miller. I wish that more people could say definitively, this is what all Frank Miller did with the Daredevil book, and we should thank him for that. And this is everything else that Frank Miller did, and we should thank him for that. I wish that we had something like that, because I did want to talk about how this is not starting in issue 159, Frank Miller comes on writing and drawing. No. Frank Miller is drawing and Roger McKenzie is writing, and at some point in the future, I believe, Frank Miller starts writing and drawing. I know that by the time you get to, like, not Born Again, Man Without Fear, he is only writing and he's not drawing anymore. So things kind of flip on the tables where he was on one side of the creative process and then he kind of went to the other side. But overall, I really, really love this book, guys. It's really artistically well done. The writing is really good too, which is why I wanted to talk about McKenzie's work on this book some. The only big problem that I really had, number one, I didn't really like Black Widow that much. I didn't really like the Ben Urich story. I thought that it could have been done a little bit better, maybe make it a little bit longer. And if it was happening today, that would have been like a 12-issue subplot where Ben Urich is slowly finding out that Daredevil is Matt Murdock, and that's kind of how I wish it had happened, but back then, having a 12-issue subplot was virtually unheard of. But overall, I really enjoyed the beginning of what many people call the Frank Miller run on Daredevil. I am very much looking forward to reading the next few volumes of this run to see where the series goes from here. So overall, I like this book, and probably everyone here already knows if they like it or not because you've already read it. So I hope that you guys liked this somewhat lengthy video. I hope that if you haven't, by some miracle chance, read anything from the Frank Miller Daredevil run, I would suggest that you go do that, but maybe keep Google handy so that you can look some stuff up, like the Deathstalker or Heather and her family and all that history and stuff here, or maybe just come back to this video after you read the book so that you can kind of refresh yourself on anything you might not have understood. But anyway, I really like this book. I hope that you guys like this video, and I will see you guys in the future with another video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.